This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I apologize for my scratchy voice. This is an actually improvement for me. But I am so glad to see each of you joining us for our November Clear Up the Chaos. We have a lot of great topics to cover. Unfortunately, one of those topics is not the overtime ruling. We're still waiting patiently for that, but you will be the first to know when that does hit. So I look forward to hearing what is decided on that, and we will of course make that a hot topic for our Clear Up the Chaos. So I'm going to hand things over. Mitch is going to start us this morning, and we will go from there. But thanks for joining us.
So what I'm going to be covering are kind of required postings, as well as some common mistakes that happen with required postings. So as I'm sure some of you are aware, back on October 19th, notification came out regarding the updated Know Your Rights poster. So that one, it covers things like discrimination in the workplace, harassment, things like that. With this update, they really wanted to try and streamline some of the language and formatting, and try to shift more towards clear examples and wording that's easier to understand. They also tried to note that harassment is a prohibited form of discrimination. They also clarified some of the definitions. So sex discrimination now includes discrimination based on pregnancy, related conditions, sexual orientation, or gender identity. It also includes equal pay discrimination for federal contractors. And one of the cool new features, they actually added a QR code, so you can pull out your phone, scan it, and it'll directly link you to the How to File a Charge webpage. One thing to note is while they pushed out that notification around October 19th, they actually made a second revision to it. So make sure you're using the October 20th revision, since they did update that. With that in mind, anytime they push out a new update, it's always a good idea to take a look at your other posters to make sure they're compliant. I know a lot of companies tend to try and update yearly, but changes can happen more frequently than that, depending on what laws are passed and when. Some of the big federally required ones are things like the employee rights under the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, the job safety and health, it's the law, which is the OSHA poster, employee rights and responsibilities under the Family and Medical Leave Act, if your company falls under FMLA, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, and your rights under USERRA, which covers military leave. There's also industry-specific ones, so things like the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act notice, and employee rights under the H-2A program if you're employing individuals who fall under the H-2A visas. Federal contractors also have some unique ones. There's a combined poster, the Employee Rights on Government Contracts, which covers the Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, the Walsh and Healy Public Contracts Act, and the McNamara-O'Hara Service Contract Act. So like I mentioned, not all updates roll out yearly, so it might be beneficial to check your posters more frequently as laws change. First step, if you're not sure which posters you'd fall under, you can actually go to the DOL's website. They have the first step poster advisor page where it asks you a series of questions. And based on your answers, it'll actually give you a list of required posters federally, along with brief summaries of each policy. From there, you also want to check your state ordinances. So they'll be viewed under each state's Department of Labor website, and they'll outline which posters are required. For Texas, for example, you can visit twc.texas.gov, search for posters, and it'll give you things like the Texas payday law, unemployment and payday law. So that one's actually a combined poster if your company has employees that would be eligible for unemployment. They have a workers' compensation poster. So it's a good idea to take a look at each state that you operate in, determine whether or not you would be required to carry certain posters and adjust accordingly. 4 states have also recently passed pay transparency laws requiring, among other things, to include pay ranges in job postings. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on things like that so that if you're pushing out job postings, you can stay on top of things. Another one that's kind of becoming more of a trend are some cities are actually pushing out local ordinances that will require certain postings. Back when I was up in Washington, we were covered under the Seattle Puget Sick and Safe Time. So we had a required posting that we needed at each of our facilities. I believe Beaumont and Corpus Christi also have some specific ones, but I don't have the particulars on those. Another thing to keep in mind that a lot of companies tend to miss, there are actually 22 different states that require postings in both English and Spanish, regardless of if you have Spanish-speaking workforce. So just to remind everybody, per wage and hour, the postings must be in a prominent and conspicuous location. So you can't hide your posters in a storage closet or an unused basement. If you have multiple locations, you may need to actually make multiple postings to ensure compliance. Nowadays, with companies shifting to more of a remote or hybrid workforce, you may also have to have electronic postings for those employees that work fully remote. So with that in mind, you may need both physical postings and digital copy postings. Digitally, you'll need to make sure your notices are accessible. So without specifically needing to request permission to view the file or computer access. Instructions to access the posting should be provided to employees. You can tuck those in your handbook. Similar to hiding a physical poster, you don't want your digital postings to be hidden in a little known electronic location. They should be available at all times. Postings would also be deemed insufficient if an employer does not customarily post notices to affected employees or other affected individuals electronically. So what that means is if 9 out of your 10 posters are posted physically, and you only have one that's posted electronically and don't tell anybody about it, that may not be considered sufficient. So some of the best practices, if you are looking at posting these things digitally, you want to design an easily accessible space in your company intranet or employee portal for federal and state posters. Maybe worth making it so that it appears automatically on their employees' computers upon logging in or setting it as the home page. Use your employee's handbook or handbook acknowledgement page to inform employees of the virtual locations of postings. And you'll want to incorporate all required notices into your applicant portal or applicant tracking system if hiring is conducted remotely. So in addition to required postings, it's also a good idea to have things like your emergency plans or EAP information readily available. So if you have the space available, you can include those on your bulletin. So to sum up, it's always a good idea to just check your federal and state DOL periodically for updates and make sure you're in compliance. Federally, I believe the fines can be around $34,000 if you're violating the federal regulations, and they can be up to $1,000 for state violations. So with that said, I'm going to pass this over to Amanda, who's got some great information on upcoming changes in the classification of independent contractors. I know postings can be tricky, but don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions.
Amanda might be struggling to get in, so we're going to push her to the back, and I am actually going to take over. Thank you, Mitch. But my topic today is going to be on the latest disability accommodation. But we will cover her topic as well. So companies with 15 or more employees must comply with the Americans with Disability Act, or the ADA. So while the ADA was put into place in 1990, today we're focused with some really unique changes, from the ripple effect of COVID to the transition to remote work for many, and a higher number of diagnoses with conditions like diabetes, obesity, autism, breast cancer, and ADHD. So along with those changes, we've also seen the types of disabilities being disclosed, that the trends and how we have to provide reasonable accommodation to these employees have also changed. So a reasonable accommodation is a change to a job application, hiring process, or the way a job is performed that will enable a person with a disability, otherwise qualified for the job, to perform the essential functions of the role and benefit from equal employment. So accommodations are considered reasonable if they don't create an unnecessary burden on the business or undue hardship, which is another term you'll hear a lot. So some more common conditions that we see today that require accommodations are back pain, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, migraines, and even carpal tunnel. So the reasonable accommodation process begins when an employee informs their manager or HR of a disability at any time during the course of employment. They do not have to disclose before they are hired or at the time they are hired. It is also important to note that the employee does not have to make an accommodation request in writing. It can be a verbal statement, and that starts the process. So don't expect an employee to come to you with, a well-defined piece of paper, saying, this is the accommodation I need, this is what I want. It's basically, it's a conversation. However, as the employer, you would be wise to always document the request. Excuse me. So for a long time, back pain was the #1 condition reported when requesting an accommodation. But right now, workplaces are seeing more accommodations requests for things like anxiety-related disabilities. This change could be in part to the spotlight placed on improving mental health in the workplace and an effort to reduce the stigma with talking about it. Of course, COVID could have played a big contributing factor to the rise of mental health issues, thus resulting in more disclosures. And social media probably plays a part. Information is reaching a wider audience. In the past, I probably saw any regulatory news in the newspaper or digital newspaper, or even on LinkedIn. But now there are HR thought leaders and influencers going viral on TikTok, which is not really where I thought I'd find some of my pressing regulatory updates, but very good source and reaching a younger demographic, and who are going to utilize that information to stand up for their workplace rights. Accommodations can be in the form of additional leave, a change in policy, reassignment, rescheduling, service animals, upgrades to their technology or additions to the technology, and of course, telework. Common workplace accommodations may include job duty changes, transition to remote work or hybrid work, or could even be reserved parking space that's closer to the building, or a workspace closer to a bathroom. Adjustable chairs, ergonomic keyboards. Those are pretty common tools that employers can provide. A trend in remote work requests has definitely grown in popularity and is probably the most requested accommodation currently. For a mental health condition like anxiety to be considered a disability, it has to substantially limit a person's ability to concentrate, interact, or communicate with others, eat, sleep, or conduct any other major life activity. So helpful accommodations for those with anxiety might be a more flexible schedule, support animals, a modified break schedule, allowing individuals to attend virtual therapy sessions during the workday, and being able to identify and reduce any triggers. Triggers could be something noise related, light related, or of course, any high stress situation. Employers should also expect to see more accommodations in connection with COVID and long COVID. So potential accommodations there could be reducing physical exertion, allowing rest breaks, allowing for medical treatment, or leaving the site to go get medical treatment, restructuring the job to remove any marginal job functions, and developing a plan of action to deal with sudden exasperation, or of course telework. So for back pain, possible accommodations could include ergonomic chairs, wheelchair ramps, nearby parking, or equipment to assist with lifting. And remote work isn't just an accommodation, but those working remotely might need specific accommodations as well. So that could, again, be ergonomic chairs, common theme, suitable lighting, or special software that allows closed captioning, recording capabilities, text to speak, translation, or searchability. Alcoholism can even qualify as a disability. The ADA may protect a qualified alcoholic who can meet the definition of disability. The ADA does not protect an individual's currently engaging in the illegal use of drugs, but may protect a recovered alcoholic or drug addict. Adjusting an employee's schedule to allow him or her to attend an AA meeting to remain clean and sober is a wonderful accommodation there. And maybe not most importantly, but importantly, the term kind of comes with a scary connotation, but accommodations do not need to break your budget whatsoever. In a survey done, employers reported that 56% of their accommodations cost nothing at all to implement, while the rest of the accommodations had maybe a typical cost of up to $500. And the benefits that come from being able to provide these accommodations are retaining valued employees, increasing productivity, eliminating costs with training new employees, increasing employee attendance, increasing diversity across the company, and definitely saving on workers' compensation or other insurance costs. Some of the things to watch out for when engaging in the interactive process, and some problem areas that are common mistakes that are made. So ending a dialogue about accommodations if no solution can be found. There still needs to be further conversation and follow up after that. Taking a manager's word that the function of a job is essential, using undue hardship too often, HR discussing the disability of an employee with a manager who does not need to know or isn't their direct supervisor, failing to consider other employment laws, like FMLA, it could come into play here, rejecting employee requests, failure to properly document the accommodation, using employee performance as a gauge to determine if an accommodation is reasonable or not considering other possible reasonable accommodations when the employee doesn't offer any specific ideas. They might not have the idea. So it like I said, it definitely has to be a conversation, and you guys can work together to find out what that best balance might be. Also, supervisors are going to be far more likely to be the individual who the employee discloses to. So making sure you train them on how to recognize a request is very, very important, and the process that follows. Disclosing and a request for accommodation have two parts. An employee has a medical condition, and that condition is creating a challenge. Excuse me. So for example, I am neurodivergent. In my situation, I have actually disclosed to my employers, but it was just in a passing conversation. It was not in regards to any challenge that I was facing. So engaging in the interactive process was not necessary. It was just a kind of a conversation topic. I have come from a job where I was on my feet 12 hours a day, moving around a lot, short interactions, and always had less sense of urgency from what the role entailed. So when I moved to this new role and it's work from home, it was a lot for me to adapt to. And I saw my symptoms kind of more prevalent than ever, far more than I had realized in my past job. So accommodations for me personally had to be made. So those are also just things to consider. So things I struggle with the most are like long meetings, or long and structure-led trainings. I do much better having material in front of me or to listen at my own pace. I also do much better if meetings are scheduled at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day. Having to stop in the middle of a task in the middle and picking it up again after a meeting or a different task can really throw me out of that flow state that I kind of thrive in, and doesn't kind of mess up. If I struggle picking things back up afterwards, I really have to be in that zone, and that's also when I'm most productive, so that's helpful. So at Ironwood, I work in marketing and I work in HR. Marketing is a very different concentration that I use, and it requires more large blocks of time for me to be successful. So it has been really, really, really helpful for me to try and plan my schedule with that in mind, and everyone around me works with me really well to do that. And it is really done so much for my productivity. There is a new trend of renaming reasonable accommodations as productivity enhancers. So some of the things that I found really helpful in my case, especially with two roles, is to block out specific days for each role. So one day I'll focus just on HR, one day I'll focus just on marketing, and not try and task switch. So at my last job, I also used to work on schedules for a team of over about 100, and it would require hours of concentration in a very loud and busy environment. We typically worked with the office door closed, and headphones were definitely not used in this job because you're customer facing 90% of the time. But when it came to schedule time, my boss insisted I use my headphones because he knew it would block out everything for me. And then he also thought it was fascinating because I listened to the same song on repeat for hours, purely for concentration. And those were some of my record times that I was able to finish that task. So things like meeting placement and noise canceling headphones can go a long way for my productivity. And while these technically could be considered reasonable accommodations, really my employers just know me and that know the environment I work best in and how to help me succeed. So while these terms might seem a little scary, if your goal is to give your employees the tools they need to be successful and be as successful as possible, then accommodations can truly be equally beneficial for both the employer and the employee. And the last trend, and I think one that could really benefit a company, is some employers doing a yearly review of the accommodations that they put in place and checking in with those employees to see if anything has changed or if the accommodation is still effective. The best resource we can probably suggest is the Job Accommodation Network. If you are in need of learning, the process, what you need to do in terms of how to handle things, paperwork, all that kind of thing. But it's probably most helpful if you are having that conversation about what accommodations might be available for the different disabilities. They have a giant list of different disabilities and pages of different accommodations that might work. And hopefully using that will help you guys meet in the middle and figure out what's best for your employee and your company overall. But that is the Job Accommodation Network, askjan.com. Highly recommend. Oh, and now I'll hand it over to Amanda.
Hi, guys. Thanks, Kyle, so much for talking about that. We're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about independent contractors and actually one of the new laws and regulations that was recently proposed. It's been about a month since it hit the news that there was going to be possibly a new independent contractor test. And actually right when that hit, beginning of last month, we actually got quite a few calls from you guys because I think, anytime you hear something like that could potentially impact your business, people a little bit go into panic mode. So we wanted to make sure to spend some time on that and also just on independent contractors in general. That's a question we get a lot. And it's also one that's really challenging for us because it's not straightforward. It's a little tricky because as we're going to talk about, in all of these laws and regulations, employee, employer, employed is very clearly defined across the Department of Labor, across the FLSA. What isn't very clearly defined is an independent contractor. So like so many other areas of HR that we've chatted about before, we a lot of times are pulling from case law and from interpretation to try to figure out what exactly the government means by independent contractor. So to start off, the new law that was proposed, or I shouldn't even say new law, the regulation change that were proposed last month, I feel like is a bit anticlimactic for you guys because all it really proposed was pulling back on independent contractor regulations that went into effect in January of 2021. And we're going to deep dive into what those were. Again, it's important to mention a few times, this is still just proposed at this point. Actually, the comment period is still available. And so that's something that could absolutely change before it's released. It may never even come to fruition. But it really bases around several different components and factors, which is why I was saying it's so difficult sometimes when you guys call in and you want to know, is this a contractor? Is this an employee? And we're like, whoa. We need to ask about 30 more questions to determine that. So again, the key change now is they're just trying to pull back on what was already set into place. But let's back up several steps so that we understand what an independent contractor is and the evolution of that. So Supreme Court has established a 5-part test. And this is generally referred to as an economic reality test. That's their most lay version of these regulations. But this is what has been set into place to determine whether someone's actually an employee or they should be classified as an independent contractor. So what it is it's 5 key factors that they instruct you to really focus on. And this is also the piece that has changed to some degree. So we'll get into that, but the 5 key factors are the degree of control exercised by the alleged employer. The second one is the extent of the relative investments the alleged employer and employee have made. The third is the degree to which the employee's opportunity for profit and loss are determined. Are those determined by the employer? For the skill and initiative required for the job that we're actually discussing. And the last one is the permanency of the relationship. And I know I went through those pretty quickly. Don't worry, we're deep diving into each one of them. But most often, a dependence on the employer indicates employee status. So what that means is the employee has nothing to invest in an enterprise beyond the time that they put in and the services they provide. So that being you as an employee, me as an employee of Ironwood, I come in and I provide my knowledge and my resources, and I do that for Ironwood. I don't do that for other people. I do that for Ironwood. Maybe not the best example, because of course we try to help you guys out as much as possible, but I work for Ironwood and not for 8 different businesses. And the employer, so in my case, Ironwood, is economically dependent upon all of us as employees. Independent contractor, though, is the one that's dependent on the customer. So not the employer as a whole, but that person might have their own business. They might have 8 customers. They might have 100 customers, but they have an investment in their equipment and their supplies, and they've got this entire customer base to fall back on. So if one customer were to go away, their business is still viable versus me just working for Ironwood. If Ironwood goes away, I'm going to be in bad shape. I'm going to have to look for a new opportunity because that's the one person that I work for. So again, this economic reality test, you're going to hear me continue to mention this. It's very important to the Department of Labor and the Social Security Administration because it's what factors into what taxes you pay, what boils down to why this makes the news so often. You know, obviously on the government's perspective, there are more taxes that come from when you as companies employ employees versus the independent contractors. And then also as the employee, the benefit is a lot of times less taxes taken out on the front end. Now, again, that could be its own series one time talking in all of the taxes, and I am not going to pretend to be the one to talk about that today. But it's very important to big companies as well as individuals. And it also really factors into profit and loss. But if you back up even a little further, back in 2010, the DOL proposed some specific record keeping requirements that was a bigger change than what we're discussing right now, because what they were requiring is that any employee, you had to go in and perform an economic reality test. So you had to go in and look at their employment and run it through all of those 5 components. And not only did you have to do that, you had to let the employee know that you were doing it. And you had to go over their rights with them under the FLSA. Which again, at its heart, just sounds like providing information, but did end up causing, quite a bit of issues just for misinformation and misunderstanding about what was happening. Why are you auditing? What's wrong? Is my job in jeopardy? So that was a big change. This less. A big way and a common term you might hear when talking about independent contractors is the ABC test. Now, ABC often applies to federal contracts, and about 2/3 of the states out there use this to define whether someone's an employee or independent contractor. Full disclosure, this is not what Texas currently uses. We'll jump to Texas next, but again, about 2/3 of them are. And if you deal in multiple states, it's important to know. So to be considered an independent contractor, the worker must meet 3 separate criteria. So think criteria A, criteria B, criteria C, very inventive. The first one is that the worker has to be free from control or direction on the performance of the work. So again, think me coming to work for Ironwood or you going to work for your company. You are generally doing the work that is assigned to you or work that is in the best interest and propels the business that you are at. And there are going to normally be some guidelines in place for that. You're not completely free to just do the job however you wish. Second, component, so B, is the work is done outside of the normal course of the company's business. Also, that has to be performed off premises. So this couldn't be somebody that was generally coming in on a day-to-day basis and going to your office. This can be somebody working from their own office, working from home, work share, whatever the case may be. And then C is the worker is customarily engaged in an independent contracting trade, an occupation, a profession, or a business. So again, think they have their own company, they have their own trade that they're providing. So again, that's ABC, which I do feel like you hear referred to quite a bit. So it's 3 factors versus the 5 that we are talking about on a federal level, again, that I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to come back to. But when you're looking at Texas, under the Texas Workers' Compensation Act, the employee is the person in the service of another under the contract of hire. And that can be expressed or implied and oral or written. So if you offer somebody employment, but it's not a written offer, it doesn't mean they're not an employee. They could still have an oral agreement. And it includes anybody that works in the normal scope and course of your business. Again, that's employee. So that's someone doing your normal business activities, advancing your company goals and objectives. Versus an independent contractor is someone that isn't in the normal scope or usual course of your business. And we'll come back to a few more examples of that. But an independent contractor is also the person who is contracted, or the best definition we have is a person who contracts to perform work or provides a service for the benefit of another. So when you are thinking about independent contractor, they act as though the employee of the employee. It's too many times to say the word employee and employer. Acts as the employer of any employee of the contractor paying wages. So what this could mean as you as an independent contractor, or if you deal with independent contractors, you might also have other employees. You direct your own activities. You perform similar functions of an employer-employee relationship. You're also free to determine the way that work is performed. So if your working hours are from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m., totally fine. If you like to use this software versus another software, again, that's all up to you because you're an independent contractor. You don't have to follow what the business that you've contracted with prefers necessarily. It might work better if you're familiar with that, but you can make those choices for how you perform the work, what equipment you use, what tools you use. You're also free to determine the way, I just said that, the work or the service is performed, but also the hours of labor. If, again, you work at 12 to 8, you work 3 12-hour days, you're hearing a lot about that lately, that's all up to you as the provider. You're also required as an independent contractor to furnish the tools, supplies, or materials to perform the work or the service. So you're going to have your own computer that you're going to work off of versus me coming to work every day, you coming to work and sitting down at your company bought computer, possibly over your company controlled internet. So as an independent contractor, you're having to provide all of those things for yourself. And then you have to have the final pieces, you have to have the skills required to perform the service. So you are one of the ones actually providing the service in question. So that's Texas standards. Again, it's a lot of very subtle nuance between ABC, between what Texas has said, and between what the federal regulations are calling for. Just to throw one more really fun factor, it's not really one, it's about to be 11, is the IRS actually has its own test. So Texas, not Texas, they have an 11-factor test, because of course they do. They have 11 factors versus 3 or 5 to determine the coverage for what federal employment tax laws are provided. So again, it's really an extension of the economic reality test and the ABC test, but it really breaks down each component and gets into the specifics. So we are going to cover those. big first one is behavioral control. And we've touched on this a little bit, and there are some kind of sub factors here. But this again is whether the business has the right to direct and control how the worker is hired and the degree that they do their work. So what sort of instructions do you give your employees? So we talk all the time about setting up a great employee experience. So whether that be from recruiting to pre-hire, to pre-onboarding, or into that orientation and onboarding period, that instruction that you're going to give that worker, that stage that you set, those company norms and day-to-day things that you would pass along to everybody over the course of business. So that would be the instructions in a very general way. It would also be how you do your work, what computer you use, what programs you use. But you're generally subject to when and where, what tools or equipment, and what workers hire or use to assist them. So what vendors you might be using, if you're then working with subcontractors, all of that would have been agreed upon by the company and the business itself versus each individual person going rogue, or as an independent contractor where you can choose, I like this vendor, and maybe I use this vendor A for this project, but maybe I have a B and a C over here I use for different types of projects. It also is where you purchase your supplies and your services. So think at the office, you have your, not break room, your office supply area, and you have so many options there. That's what's provided for you. If you want anything else, you've got to go buy it for yourselves or put in a special request. But those are the supplies provided to everyone versus independent contractor, where obviously whether you're in your own office, you've got a home office, you're deciding what all of those supplies are. And I'm simplifying it by using office supplies, but you're making all of those decisions. You also, as an independent contractor, what work is performed by each individual, and then what sequence or order that they follow. So a lot of that boils down to the instruction needed. Again, what kind of started at the top, think about from that day one when you're coming in and you're setting those norms and those expectations. Here is how we do business here. Independent contractor would be inventing that or setting that for themselves. And even if no actual instructions are given, specific behavioral control might exist if the employer has the right to control how they're achieved. So they're setting the deadlines versus an independent contractor taking on a project and coming back and telling you, okay, this will be done by December 15th, or even and possibly later coming back and saying, well, the timeline might change because of X, Y, Z. The business might lack the knowledge of some of the highly specified professionals. So this is a key one you hear brought up quite a bit is, it's not an employee or a role that you normally have. It's something extra. It's an added service or benefit. I use the example a lot of times just because it's pretty straightforward. For years and years, I worked for a clinic, and we had a contract with the state of Texas, so with Health and Human Services. So it was highly regulated with how we do our work. And one of their instructions for their contract, which largely kept us all employed, was that we had to provide service coordination, case management. So we had to provide, that information base for the clinic services in the patient's native language. And this company, we were all of the northern half of Dallas County. So millions of people, hundreds and hundreds of different languages. If that family spoke Urdu, we had to go out and find somebody that could interpret Urdu. And then we needed to set up a contract agreement with them so that then they could go with our providers into the home and translate for the family in their native language. So that all of that backstory to be, that is not something we could do or provide ourselves. We didn't have anyone on staff that could speak that particular language or dialect. We had to have someone contract with us outside of the normal scope of our business and our activities to come in and provide a service. So it wasn't someone, that we needed so often that we needed a full-time employee to do that. But we did have to set up contracts with them, whether that be for an hourly rate, whether that be for travel. There could be lots of other components going on. But it's who has control over the situation, over the performance, or who has given up that right, which to a degree you do as an employee. I touched on this a little bit in talking about orientation, but the other key part is what sort of training is to provided. An employee comes on board, and even if they're a seasoned professional, to some degree, you're going to have some training. Again, maybe company specific. Independent contractor knows how to do their job. They're going to have their own methods. There's not any specific training. So those are some of the behavioral things to keep in mind. Again, keep in mind, this is IRS factor, so it's going to be very detailed. The next big component is who has financial control. So the facts show whether the business has a right to control the certain aspects of the worker's job. So this is the extent to which workers have unreimbursed business expenses. So independent contractors are going to be much more likely to have unreimbursed expenses than employees, because most of the time you've either got a policy or practices in place that if you incur a business expense as an employee, maybe the policy is it's up to a certain amount. You don't have to have approval, and then over $50, $100, you do have to have approval. As the employee, if it's to perform your job, most likely there's some sort of process or policy or procedure to be reimbursed for that. Versus again, the independent contractor are already supposed to have the skill. They have their own supplies. They have their own equipment. So some of those day-to-day things, they're not being provided for them by anyone else. They're having to set that. When they get a flat rate gig to perform a service, they're not having a line item in there for internet costs or for the amount of paper that was provided. They're going to have fixed ongoing costs that are just their overhead, whether it's being performed or not. Employees have unreimbursed expenses in connection, independent contractors might have unreimbursed expenses in connection with the services over the business and what they perform. So another big part of the financial aspect is the extent of investment. Who's invested? Who wins and loses when the company makes money? An employee normally has no real investment in their work other than their own time. Now, again, a case could be made that if you perform well, maybe you get bonuses, or, when the business does well, everyone does well. But essentially, if you go in, you're providing your time. An independent contractor has a significant investment in their company. They have all of the tools, they have all of the supplies. It is a major economic factor if something comes or goes or isn't reimbursed, or if a job were to fall through, or if they weren't to get paid. A significant investment is going to be much more likely to point towards independent contractor status versus employee status. Third big financial thing, the extent to which the worker makes services available to the rest of the market. So, you have an employee, let's say, performing work out in the field. They might have on their company branded polo, and they're not out there selling their own business over the course of the day. At least let's kind of hope not, if you have a policy against that, which is pretty normal. Independent contractor, again, they are most likely performing that service that is something outside of your normal scope. So it's an addition. So they're out there in their own company branded thing. If somebody sees them performing work and has questions about whether they're for hire, whether or not they're taking on other clients, they can stop what they're doing right then and set up their next job. If they have other employees, they could then, start to outsource that work to their employees. They are out there in the free market and can pick up more jobs and work for as many clients and set their own parameters there, again, versus you as the employee. When you're on work time, you're working for that singular employer. And independent contractors, again, as I mentioned, they're often going to advertise. They're going to have a very visible business. So if they are out in truck, it might be branded. They probably have their own business cards branded with their business name. Again, they might have gear depending on the type of the business. They might have equipment that's branded. But they're out there in the market still actively playing. Other key financial thing to keep in mind is how the business pays the worker. Again, as an employee, when you come on, normally your choice is direct deposit or check. And sometimes it's hard to even get the check option anymore, or which account you want it to go into. Independent contractor could specify that they have to have an invoice up front. Maybe they have 50% down at the beginning, 50% at the end. They are able to set up how they are paid versus employee, where you as the company are going to set up every other week, once a month, weekly, whatever the case may be. Employees are also generally guaranteed a regular wage. So whether that's the hourly or weekly or other period of time, that normally again determines that you're an employee. Even if you end up getting a bonus or if the salary in the role has a commission of some sort, independent contractors, a lot of times it's flat rate. It's per work project, per gig. We hear a lot about gig workers and the gig economy. You can have independent contractors that are paid hourly, you know, and the example that I just used about using an interpreter, you know, within that contractor agreement, it was normally set up, you know, that you had to have so many hours of work for someone to do a house call. If it was canceled, it had to be within this many hours. There might be a travel expense depending on the arrangement, but it could be hourly, but a lot of times it's flat rate or gig work. It's for performing the project or the gig. Another financial thing to keep in mind, the extent to which the worker can realize profit or loss. So again, that kind of harkens back to what we were talking about with the Texas Workforce Commission, is who loses, who has an investment in there. Again, if you've got your own tools and workplace and equipment and all of your supplies, if a pipe bursts in your ceiling and you lose all of that, you're just out that money, versus a pipe bursts at the office, the employer is going to be the one to actually repurchase or repair all of that. Independent contractors are going to be a lot more dependent on their particular profit and loss than a greater company as a whole. And then the last batch of factors, I know it's been a lot for the IRS components, is the type of the relationship. So is there a written contract in place that defines the actual relationship between the two parties? Now, it actually is one of the lesser criteria, which sounds kind of counterintuitive to me. But, you know, the components of actually defining what is in the contract, not that it's not important, but it's how the relationship works. Again, it's more about who's providing what, how is it going to be done, who's instructing the other, versus what the actual contract is, dollars and cents or hours and things like that. Again, not that the contract isn't important, but the overwhelming business relationship and the interactions more specifically plays into factor for that employee versus independent contractor. So also, are benefits provided? So this is a key, easy one to point to for employee versus contractor. If benefits are provided, so think insurance, think vacation pay, sick pay, that points to an employee. The power a company has to either grant more benefits on a yearly basis, it's open enrollment season now, or to take those benefits away would, again, lean more towards the employee-employer relationship versus that independent contractor who's probably going to have their own either private insurance set up, or maybe they get off the insurance marketplace, but they're not actually getting time off from the employer. That's not a normal piece of contracting. Again, a lot of times because things are by gig or by project, but they'll have their own benefits and have control over that. And then another key part of the relationship, which again was in both the 3 and the 5 factors, is the permanency of a relationship. If a company has a worker with them and they expect that relationship to continue indefinitely, that's more likely to be employee situation. Now, this has nothing to do with at-will employment states. No one brings on employee and just says, you know, you're going to be here forever. You hope they are. You hope they're going to be with you for as long as the company is. But you hire that person with the intention that they are going to be there until they retire, hopefully. Versus, again, that independent contractor is going to be there until that project is done. Or for the example that I was using with the interpreters, at some point the children we served would then transfer into the school district. So at some point that job was going to end. There was no longer going to be work for that Urdu interpreter. So it wasn't just this open-ended contract forever like you might have with an employee. And the extent to which the services are performed as a key aspect of the business. So again, we've touched on this again with the 5-factor and the 3-factor. So again, you can see all of these common themes, even through all of these different regulatory agencies. Is it outside the scope of your regular business? Is it in addition? Is it an upgrade? It's not something that you need to have full time. Who has control and who's going to direct those activities? So that is the last of the IRS's very, very lengthy 11-factor test. So again, I know that was a lot of information to all essentially come back and say, again, that the new proposed rule was taking those 5 pieces and changing the weighting. So again, just a little bit of background about the new one as we're wrapping up here in the last few minutes. Let's take it even further back than the 2010 case that I brought up about having to document status. FLSA, so Fair Labor Standards Act, that I have been referencing as we go, and just about anybody that calls us probably hears the acronym, created back in 1938, was established to set labor conditions. So think historic, thinking back into old textbooks or old videos, prior to the Fair Labor Standards, you could have the 80-hour work week. You could have the 15-hour day. You could lock the employees in the sweatshop and not have emergency exits. This set the basis for health, efficiency, and general worker well-being. It also, very importantly, also set a minimum wage. So that base wage, and it standardized the 40-hour work week so that anything worked more than your regular rate of pay over 40 hours had to be at time and a half. Again, I'm oversimplifying that, but that's what the FLSA set up. And that was set up again for employees. It didn't speak at all to independent contractors. Back then, that sort of thing didn't exist. So then for 7 decades, that's what we worked off of. And then this has become a much more hot topic here in the last 20 years. And again, even in the last 5 to 10 years, if you really think, 10 years ago, gig work wasn't something that we talked about very often. So what it was proposed last year, and again, because then I covered 13 different points between now and then, the key factors that were proposed last year that the new law is talking about pulling back were those 5 factors. So we've been talking about them, but they're just stated more generally. Opportunity for profit loss, permanency, the degree of control, whether the work is integral to your business, and what skill and initiative are required. So again, back in January 2021, those 5 things were broken out essentially into 2 groups. 2 of those factors were considered the core factors. So this was what was really important. The other 3 were important, but if these 2 things were true, you were considered an employee or an independent contractor. Whereas if these 2 things were not true, even if the other 3 happened to be factual, it doesn't mean that it overweighted the other 2. So the 2 of the 5 that were most important was the degree of control over the work and the opportunity for profit and loss. So if those 2 things were true, that is what established you as either the employee or to the contractor. So there were 5 factors that they'd come in and consider, but these were the most important. Think of it as a weighted exam. These were weighted as 40% each. And then the other 3 got, they're 9, 8%, whatever that comes out to. I can't do math in my head anymore. But these were more important. And what the proposal now is to revert back to those 5, but it's coming and looking at it from the totality of the situation. More of an even playing field, and maybe it's not exactly 20% for each of the 5 factors, but it's really looking at it as a whole versus really these 2 things deciding whether or not someone should be classified. I shouldn't say is, I said should be classified as employee or independent contractor. So again, right now, that unweighted hasn't been pulled back. It's still at that notice period. I know we spent a ton of time on contractors today. I'm sure as we get updates, we'll continue to provide those for you guys. We won't have to spend this much about it, but we will obviously keep up with this as we talk month to month to see whether after the comment period, if it moves forward, if it continues to push through, that could also be impacted heavily today by whatever happens by the end of tonight or into the end of the voting season. But we will definitely keep this on our radar and definitely keep you guys up to date with that. And then any other questions that you have about contractors, you know that we are also always here and happy to try to help you. Like I said, it's a little less straightforward. So if you do call or you do email, do expect we'll probably have to set up some time to talk through it. But that is the very long, not short version of the new independent contractor law.
Thanks so much, Amanda and Mitch and Kyle, and for everyone joining us today. I know that was a lot of information to cover. So if you do have a question that has popped up, I have received one. When are new contractor rules going into effect?
Unfortunately, don't have an answer for you. It's still in that comment period, which even that has been extended again. So we don't really know. It will be something we'll keep on our radar and keep you guys informed about each month, but you generally have quite a bit of time to adjust to any change like this. And they're probably going to argue about it and change it 16 times before it goes into effect, but we'll keep you updated.
For sure. Well, I appreciate that. And just a friendly reminder, as a client of ours, you have access to this wonderful team and their knowledge and expertise. So if you haven't filled out an agreement, I will send that out in our follow-up email. So watch for that and complete that if you haven't had the opportunity to yet. And I will be getting all of that to y'all today or tomorrow with the recording as well, if you want to share it with anyone internally. But as always, thanks so much for joining us. Our next Clear Up the Chaos is the second Tuesday of December, which is December 13th. And I look forward to having all of you join. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon. Bye.